Good evening. Hi, I'm Carter Ham, and I have the privilege of serving as the president here at the Association of the United States Army. We welcome you who are present in the General Gordon R. Sullivan Conference and Events Center here at AUSA, and we're very pleased that you've joined us for another in our series of the General Lemnitzer Lecture Series. It's a series of presentations where distinguished authors come and speak with us about relevant military topics, and we're especially pleased at this evening's presentation. There's a couple of recognitions. Lieutenant General retired Dick Treffry and his wife are here. General Treffry served in Laos, and he told me that he's here, Joe, to make sure you keep the facts straight. So we'll see how that goes. You'll get feedback, I think, from Joe.
I want you to know I cheated on one of your questions on your test.
That's right.
I asked a buddy.
Yeah, that's good. And I lost him, but Mr. Steve Austin is here. Steve, we're the Assistant Chief of the Army Reserve. And Steve, we're very glad that you've joined us this evening as well. But we're thankful that all of you have joined us for what we think will be a wonderful presentation. I told Colonel Celeski that I'm old enough to have known that the United States military conducted operations in Laos, and that was the extent of my knowledge. I knew we did something, but I didn't really have any idea until your book was made available of what that entailed. And it's a fascinating story. I think some would make the argument that perhaps the first strategic employment of special operations forces since their official founding after the end of World War II. I think there are some very interesting applications and lessons that can be carried forward from the Laos experience to what we're experiencing today. And as we think about, as General Milley reminds us, about a return to great power competition, the proper role of special operations forces in partnership with other elements of government. And I think Colonel Celeski will walk us through some of that. Administratively, I would remind you that we are very fortunate and honored that this evening is being presented on C-SPAN. So when it comes time for questions and answers, we'll pass around the microphone, and I would ask that you would wait for the microphone so that the viewing audience on C-SPAN can hear your question, and we'd ask you to just briefly introduce yourself and then present your question. Our presenting author, Colonel Joseph Celeski, is not only a distinguished author and scholar, he's a warrior. I grew up in the Special Forces. I think, if I remember correctly, in 1984, when Special Forces was first designated a branch, you were amongst the first officers in the United States Army to have joined Special Forces as a branch in the Special Forces branch of the United States Army. Multiple operational deployments, some of which he can probably talk about, some of which he probably still can't talk about. It's just such is the nature of such things. Most recently, his most recent military service was as the commander of 3rd Special Forces Group, multiple deployments to include as 2 times, I think, as commander of the Combined Joint Special Operations Task Force in Afghanistan. So ladies and gentlemen, please, a warm welcome for Colonel Joseph Celeski. Joe, off to you.
Thank you, sir, that was a great introduction. I want to thank AUSA, its leadership, the Institute for Land and Warfare, and AUSA Books, if I've got all that right, for their sponsorship of the book. It was extremely helpful. I don't know if they're here. I also want to thank the team at Casemate. I tell you, that is a military authors friendly publisher. They were willing to work with me and do absolutely whatever I wanted to do. Hey, give me the next slide, please. Quick look at the agenda. I'm not going to talk for long, and we'll try to spend more time on question and answer period. These slides, through the research, I think we collected over 3,000 original photographs that have never been seen of special operators and their activities in Laos. So what I've done is, you've got a batch in the book, which I thought were some of the better ones, and all the pictures in this presentation or just some more of the pictures so you kind of get a good view. And I'm going to show 3 rare video clips. Okay, next slide. Quite frankly, when I grew up in SF, people talked about Laos occasionally. You only heard mention of White Star. We had no idea what HOTFOOT did, Project 404, and as you see in your book, the 46 SF company operating in Thailand. So I knew I couldn't write a book till I retired. You know, the last couple of years in SF, quite busy. I spent 10 years as a senior fellow at the Joint Special Operations University and had to write research papers and teach and travel internationally for the Combating Terrorism course. So that wasn't a great time to start writing. So I kind of did the retired thing. Although since I've retired, I've worked every day of my life. Thanks to my lovely wife over there. I don't mind, you know, she took care of the house and the place for 30 years while I traveled the world. I'm more glad to help start paying back some of that stuff. But anyway, that was it. Untold story. I haven't found yet till today somebody else is going to tell the story. This might be the final book about it. There's very little in the archives. I found that out. Most of the stuff you had to get from the veterans. Their stories, their documents, and their pictures, which is kind of good if you're going to be a military writer. You need at least 3 places to corroborate the story, you know, or you're just writing anecdotes. It's a unique book because the war inside Laos was run by the Interagency State Department, controlled by the ambassadors, and they used their State Department counterinsurgency model. It's the first use, I think, of soft graduating from individual team deployments to the geographic commanders, to where we're going in large units and achieving strategic utility. Colin Gray, the famous strategist in explorations and strategy, identified soft strategic utility, and I'm going to mention 3 that I think you can find throughout this book. The first is buy time for diplomacy to work. Number 2, reassure allies. And number 3, prevent or stave off defeat. Next slide. We went to Southeast Asia in light of the theory of the fallen dominoes. You know, if one country falls to communism, the next one does. It's the Eisenhower strategy to start military aid and financial aid to Thailand, South Vietnam, and Laos. We established an embassy in there in 1955, and that begins the military assistance program. Next slide. Laos is a landlocked country, very poor, no major industry to export. You notice on the eastern edge is the Annamite Mountains, the border with Vietnam. On the west is the Mekong River. Up in the north, in kind of a circular area in the middle, is the Plain of Jars Plateau. And in the south, another large circle is the Bolivens Plateau. These are going to be major areas of combat operations. Next slide. Like, I guess every country back then, ancient kingdom, they war and break into 3. The French, when they colonized, reunite them into the current Laos. After the Japanese are defeated during their occupation of Laos, the French come back to Indochina. The Laotians don't want them there. They break into 2 notions. Let's use a political process to gain independence, work with the French. The other one is radical. Let's use the communist model, you know, to overthrow the government. This results in 3 factions after the Geneva Convention. You're going to have leftists, which are the communists. You're going to have neutralists, which is like, we don't want any foreign powers in our country. And you're going to have the rightists, so they're pro-Western, pro-democracy. Next slide. There are some geopolitical considerations, because remember, this is a State Department-run operation. So diplomacy is going to have a big impact. North Vietnam thinks they own Laos, historically. And then, you know, they're going to put up to 40,000 troops on the border to support operations on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And the Geneva Convention, the agreements had restrictions on no foreign forces could stay in Laos, and they couldn't establish any foreign bases. French are an exception. They get 3,000 troops in a couple bases, and they're going to turn into military trainers for the Laotian army. The big elephant in the room is, will China intervene? Because remember, we're going in there in the shadow of the Korean War. Okay, next slide. I think I kind of talked to this on the map. Basically, a small country. What's interesting is it grows from level areas along the Mekong River, and as you go east and north, the mountains rise and rise and rise. It's not a tropical climate, and it doesn't have a jungle. It has triple canopy forest. There are no roads, improved roads outside the cities. There's no telephone lines, and there's no electrical lines. The roads outside the city, the colonial routes, are basically hard-packed dirt. And again, those two plateaus, one on the north and south, are going to be key terrain because one of the few places you can maneuver openly. Next slide. Mekong River, you see how the mountains start rising as you look east. That's downtown Savannah, typical. Laotian town, a lot of French influence, French architecture. Down below on the left, the Plain of Jars in the north, that plateau. Nobody knows who made these, and nobody knows why they made them. Today's mystery. The thing that's really going to affect combat ops is there are two monsoons, but it's the summer monsoon that brings the most rain, fog, mist, and it really hampers mobility, flight operations, etc. Next slide. There's no census. This is kind of a guess. 3 types of Laotians, roughly. Those that live along the Mekong River, we want to call them kind of the original Laos. As you go up in the mountains and mountain valleys, you got the Lao Tung. And then the higher elevations, you got a bunch of warrior tribes. And this is where the Hmong, back then people used to call them the Mao. But you got the Hmong, who are going to be used for guerrilla warfare. You can see their religion. The religion is going to impact because Buddhists and animists don't like to kill other human beings. That's why you see a lot of low-level casualties in their engagements, because most of them are pointing their rifles in the air, both sides, and shooting and making noise. I guess whoever made the most noise won the battle. Okay, next slide. This is a typical Maoist communist model. A bunch of leaders, the vanguard, get together and go, let's have a communist thing. They form a political party, and then they form an action arm, their People's Army, which is called the Pathet Lao. Next slide. These are just characteristic. If you study that type of insurgency, comes with them all. Now, North Vietnamese Army, or back then the Viet Minh, are not up there, but they operate in Laos in battalion, regimental, and later divisional size units. Quite a presence in Laos. Can you show video 1? This from the National Archives.
Near Sam Nur, the Laotian People's Liberation Army has established a military school called the Commandam Military School in honor of a hero of the war against the French. The school was founded 15 years ago during the Resistance War, when the People's Liberation Army fought against the Vientiane government in the Savannakhet and Khammouane provinces of southern Laos and had control of some areas. It was a day before graduation, and the students were in their final phases of training. They learned the duties of the soldiers of the Laotian People's Liberation Army to destroy the enemy, to mobilize the people, to participate in production. Graduation was held in one of the larger caves.
Bring up the next slide. Okay, government forces. There's enough forces for Laos sort of to defend itself, but it's a light infantry force, defensive. They got regular infantry, then volunteer infantry. The parachute battalions are the strategic reserve reaction force, and they're all backed up by militia. They have 5 military regions. It's kind of like a warlord general, and each region gets to maneuver his own troops and doesn't help the other guy. They do have armor and artillery regiments. They have a small Mekong River flotilla force. And the success story, it comes in the 60s with the Air Commandos training the Laotian Air Force. They grow into a very successful force with fixed wing helicopters, AC-47s, and T-28 strike fighter bombers. Okay, next slide. America's concerned that the Laotians are not using American gear properly or not being trained by the French. They sent in General Heinckes to do a survey in early 1959. No surprise, appalling results. America negotiates with France to get our military trainers in there alongside the French trainers, is the bottom line for Operation HOTFOOT. But due to the secrecy, they're going to go in there in civilian clothes. They're going to have fake IDs like, I work for the Forest Service. I'm a clerk at the embassy. And they're not allowed to have weapons. Some of the dressing in the civilian clothes, the teams wear their khakis and their boots because they kind of want to look military. They don't have weapons, but like all good SF guys, they go see their buddies in the Laotian army, and pretty soon they got M1s, pistols, and machine guns, so they're in pretty good shape. This comes out of the 77th Special Forces Group, which turns into the 7th Group. They deploy in August of 1959 under the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Bull Simons, famous for the Sante raid. He actually does 2 tours in Laos. They're on 6-month rotations because of the restriction that you can't station American forces in Laos. So they're going to be TDY. They're going to do 3.5 rotations, and then the dynamics are going to change. In December of 1960, renegade Captain Congley of the Laotian paratroopers actually conducted a coup in August, but by December, the counter-coup forces sparked the Battle of Vientiane, and he's driven out. He goes up to the Plain of Jars and joins forces with the Pathet Lao and the North Vietnamese. So he kind of turns traitor. But Special Forces teams, that's when they first start entering battle. Next slide, please. Just some, typical pictures. How the guys dressed. Most of the teams lived in villas. You got assigned a Jeep and a trailer. Over on the lower left, across the river in the flatland, is one of the major training areas in Luang Prabang. And then the teams help improve proficiencies by building ranges and whatnot. Next slide. That's in the 4 major training centers. They opened up a 5th site up in Can Kay on a Plain of Jars. Notice the French guy in the center. And if you look way in the background is the American trainer. Americans are only allowed to do individual skills training. The French do the crucial weapons and the tactics training. A lot of animosity builds up, a lot. But just some pictures of Can Kay. In January of 1961, they're driven off. When Congley and the neutralists come up to the Plain of Jars, link up with the Pathet Lao, they go to capture this fort. So the team evacuates under artillery fire based on an intrepid C-47 pilot from Air America. Next slide. There is PSYOP, not as much as we do today, which is unfortunate. But there is a government PSYOP unit, leaflets, handbills, clandestine radio facilities, kind of co-run between the agency and the Laotian government. And the lower right is Ray Ambrosiak. There were 3 psychological operations teams rotated in during this period, but none did after the withdrawal of October 62. Next slide. Air America is the only air support. Air Force can't fly from the restrictions. They can do reconnaissance flights. Air America is the Air Force for U.S. troops in Laos, for resupply and transport. There are about 5 major airfields in Laos that you could call an airport. The rest of them are landing strips and then helicopter landing zones. Could you play the next video?
Lima, Echo, Juliet.
Juliet, Lima, go ahead.
Echo, Juliet, coming up primary, Delta Zulu, operations normal.
Yes.
The average mission we fly here, we carry 13 pallets. So we'll just drop 1 pallet the first time and use that kind of as the bore site. What the area we picked as our aiming point. If that's okay, then we drop 2 at a time. Even if it's a little bit off, we can still correct it on the next pass and just make a total of 7 passes.
Okay, next slide. Due to increased NVA operations in Laos, President Kennedy has had enough of it. He puts a military assistance advisory group in the embassy, and he orders all the teams to go full officially U.S. military. They change into uniform, carry their own weapons and arms, and become combat advisors. And for the rest of their time in Laos, more and more teams come, and they spend their time in the 5 military regions out in combat until they're all withdrawn in October 1962. Up to 44 teams, eventually 400 SF guys. I've never seen that many SF guys, including Afghanistan. That's quite a bit. They're going to experience the first casualties, 2 dead and 2 captured POW. Cap Moon and Sergeant Ballinger were captured. Cap Moon dies in captivity trying to escape. And Ballinger stays a prisoner of war until August of 62 in a repatriation because America won't admit we have Army troops in Laos. Kind of sad thing. Okay, next slide. I won't go into these in detail, but these are all the major combat operations the teams participated with the Laotian Army. Okay, next slide. I mean, all those are in the book. The first guerrilla warfare program starts in '61 with the agency. They ask for help from SF teams. Starts out slow, little 100-man units, works its way up to battalion size, and by the end of the war, General Vang Pao on the lower right had built up 10,000 forces and is operating really at brigade and regimental level, these group mobiles. Next slide. This just gives you an idea of the extent of those activities, centered around the Plain of Jars. Okay, next slide. One of the major combat activities in 1962, the battle and siege of Nam Ta. The Laotian Army has 5,000 troops in Nam Ta to kind of make a statement in the face of the peace negotiations. The NVA and Pathet Lao want to make a Dien Bien Phu out of it, and they do. They close the airfield. SF teams up there were working on the front lines under fire, under artillery fire. They're there the day the enemy attacks and routs 5,000 Laotian Army guys who all run west, swim across, boat across the Mekong River and go into Thailand, abandoning the couple of SF teams in Nam Ta. They are rescued later by Air America helicopter. They go down to the Mekong River, link up with another team, and they're told from the Army attaché, hey, go back up that trail and see how far they got. So they go about 30 kilometers up the trail to Ban Phuong, and over a period of days, there are 2 heavy skirmishes that occurred. That's the limited advance of the enemy. Everybody goes back to the river town of Ban Hui Sai, and that's kind of the end of their story. That full story is in a book. This battle also included the first combat paratrooper drop. 3 SF team members went with the 55th Parachute Battalion and dropped in under mortar and artillery fire to maneuver west of Namtan. Okay, next slide. This is the second Unconventional Warfare program, training Ka and Celeski tribal guerrillas. Basically same model, 100-man unit, if you can find that many. Equipment provided by the agency. Now what's different is the agency's kind of out of Schlitz. And so they let the SF teams run this whole program. It grows to about 11 teams. Big operation. But the agency, you know, provides the equipment and a little bit of guidance. Next slide. This is the southern zone on the Bolivins. All the details, not important, but it starts over here on the right, Ban Hui Kong, branches La Tassin, and then branches back west to Pak Song. The companies are named Ka Tribal Company 1, 2, so they're just called K1 and K2. These guys get up to all the way up to portions of 8. Next slide. Then there's a northern zone up near Saravane. They moved to Phuket. Then they branch out also to Ban Nong Bua. They finish training up K8 through K12. Everybody's trained. Some of the teams go back out to work. You know, these guys came from villages. They go back out to help them patrol. Next slide. No, not the video. Next slide. Okay, you see gathering them up, training and equipping. They go out to the Phuket campsite, Camp 106, and just some activities. Okay, now the video. This is the rarest video and the only known video I have of Special Forces guys in Laos. It was secretly taped by an SF sergeant. Bring up the foreign internal defense slide. Okay, not everybody's a combat advisor. Like all countries, to improve their proficiencies, you got to do some training courses. You can see the variety of courses. And the lower picture in the middle is a ranger school, and the lower right is the Dong Heni Officers Academy. You know, the other ones are self-explanatory. Next slide. Before the next phase begins, per the Peace and Reconciliation Agreement, all American forces are ordered out of Laos by October 1962, and they leave. The MAG goes down secretly into Thailand and operates out of Bangkok. Going in 1964 to 66, embassy, we need more people. You know how it is in the military, we ain't never got enough people. And Joint Chiefs of Staff create Project 404 to send in individual advisors in to assist the Air and Army attaches. These people are going to be attached to the embassy so they don't count against military forces in Laos. They're going to be called Assistant Army Attaches and Assistant Air Force Attaches. They are basically the eyes and ears of the ambassador. Lower left, Jack Cassidy, a very famous cartoonist today, was with the Neutralists. Way back in the middle there, by that artillery piece, is Lieutenant Colonel Al Rosin. These aren't all SF guys. Army, infantry, and artillery guys also served in Project 404. Next slide. And again, they are out in major combat operations. Dennis Lidd with Neutralists, Rube Moretta and Savannah Cat Paxi, Lieutenant Colonel Charlie Brewington works with Van Powell up in by the Plana Jars. Next slide. One of the things you do in counterinsurgency, you want to keep out of the limelight of the press and scrutiny, is to go train in a friendly foreign country. So the 46th Special Forces Company goes to Thailand, goes to Thailand in 1966. Their purpose is to train with Thailand for their counterinsurgency. There's about 400 of them in the unit. And what they do is they handpick a certain amount of teams and are directed and assisted by the agency to open 6 secret training camps that nobody ever knew about. In these training camps, they train Hmong guerrillas, they train Lao military, and they train volunteers from the Thailand Army, battalions of them, artillery and infantry. All goes on in secret. They also, after they send them back in Laos, if they get ravaged, they come back for refit, rearm. They do a condensed schedule, and then they send them back to Laos. The 46th Company is, I think, disestablished. I don't know, General Treffy, you may remember. It's between 72 and 74. They're inactivated, leave Thailand, go to the 1st Special Forces Group in Okinawa and become the 3rd Battalion. Next and last slide. Oh, no, just some of their activities. I apologize. Again, just, pictures nobody's ever seen. Lieutenant Colonel Bartelt was the commander of the 46th. Next slide. Again, it's an interesting picture of the secret camp. On the lower left, I found that from Jim Bruton from the 46th. There was a claim that they never went to Laos. They were ordered, no, you can't go across the river. But in fact, we had 46 SF teams, a couple of them, went up into Laos and helped train. I swear this is the last slide. Okay, I'm just going to give you my big takeaway. And I think it's important, Army planners and maybe strategists, because Afghanistan is very similar. In the early years when we were there, very similar to what happened in Laos. When we decide to do something like this again, we really need to take a hard look at what the culture is like, at what the politics is like, and what the will of the people is like if they're willing to mobilize, and back up the effort to win against the insurgents. To me, that's probably the most powerful lesson you take away from Laos. Now for SF, they get their strategic utility as a form of Army land power, and it is Army land power. We don't belong to U.S. SOCOM. We belong to the U.S. Army. They also might have been best utilized by the ambassadors because it really didn't stretch them for special reconnaissance or like direct action raid. They could have, maybe tried to rescue the POWs or did some strikes on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Other than that, it's small stuff. Could have been more civil affairs ops, but that's about it. Okay, folks, I hope you enjoyed the rare photos and the video clips. You learned something about Laos.